So nice to see everybody again for the last time this semester. But I'm glad you're all here. Strangely enough, I don't have any announcements. Nothing to read. Okay, so I did want to comment. Indeed, I was very, very pleased that once again, 3 weeks in a row, we have not had a phone go off. So, I mean, that's like a record for this class, and I've been here a long time. And so, again, just so you know, please turn off your phones. You've been very good. So let's see if we can do one more time, okay? All right, well, since I really have no more announcements, I would like to again mention that this is indeed the last class of the semester. And I want to take this time to once again thank Dr. Kicklighter for all his kind efforts with Ollie. Certainly appreciated. I would also ask him to mention to Dr. Bohannon that we appreciated her as well, and that we would hope that she would once again grace us with her presence as well. Perhaps she will make a class next year. That would be great. So, thank you so much. Well, today's lecture, from what I understand, is about Parliament. And Parliament has developed, let's put it that way, developed into one of the truly great democratic institutions in the world. Well, that is until Brexit, but that's another story. But, you know, as far as Brexit goes, it's glad, you know, I'm really kind of feeling good about this because we have finally taught the British something about governance. I mean, think about it. After all these years, we have taught them how to have a totally dysfunctional branch of government, okay? So I really appreciate what are able to do. So again, we're going to be talking about democracy today, so it is my pleasure once again to introduce, for the last time this semester, Ollie's own benevolent despot, yes, you will get a break, Dr. Joseph Kicklighter.
Frank, thank you. And I appreciate you all being here this spring, and I hope I will get to see you in the fall for something that I'm doing that's new and, for me, very different. It's a year-long class on European diplomacy between the world wars. I've already prepared the first lecture, which deals with the powers before World War I. And if you stop and think, you'll remember lots and lots of this, I'm sure, from school. And it's not nearly as, I would say, obscure as some of my medieval material, I suspect. So it will seem familiar. I am, with great deference to Frank, leaving out all the military. It's essentially a diplomatic and political course that essentially starts with 1919 and goes on through to 38, 39. But more or less trying to emphasize the relations between the major powers in Europe, and of course bringing in Japan and the United States constantly, but that's just part of the story and it can't be done otherwise. Our tale that ends this course, however, is a not unrelated one having to do with Parliament, which, as Frank indicated, is still around. And I might say, of all the medieval institutions that we think of in terms of the Middle Ages, I guess that's about as long-lasting and really as much a creation of the Middle Ages as any other. Because let's face it, monarchs sort of come with the territory. I guess you could say the English monarchy, or now British monarchy, come from medieval periods, but there have been monarchs around a long time. However, Parliament, and we are talking now about the British Parliament and no other, has lasted a very long time. As Frank indicated, there are certain issues today. Some of you may have actually seen them on, what station, C-SPAN is it, or some other station where they used to show them on, I think, Sunday nights maybe, and it's kind of interesting to watch them holler at each other, and that at least they go on and they're honest about it, right? I mean, they don't just go on television and talk ugly about the other side, but they scream and holler at each other aplenty, and that, of course, is very, very interesting. And what we are seeing now, and particularly as we are talking about the late Middle Ages, is how this actually comes to being. Not that it is a sign of democracy. Oh, Lord, that is one of those things, if you put it on a multiple choice, and they're little, they just tune to think, oh, well, that's got to be right. It's something about democracy. But that is, they'll say, that's a trick question, man. No, it isn't. There is nothing democratic about Parliament. That is going to come about, and as I always like to say, after my period. So I'm not responsible for that. That's a whole other issue. What we are involved here today is more or less the creation and development during the medieval period, particularly the 14th century. And what I call institutionalization, because we talk about parliaments and so forth, and noting that actually there was a parliament in France, and there were parliaments in what became Spain. It is the idea of a consultative body, or even a representative institution, is not limited to the English-speaking world. It's simply, and again, I think about, if you want to go to medieval Japan, I guess, or feudal Japan, and the idea that the king, or in their cases the emperor, it's very odd to think the king or the ruler is not any figure who is absolute. I mean, even the popes had the College of Cardinals to deal with, or at other times maybe councils. In other words, representative institutions. In strict terms of medieval or feudal, we talk about the court of the king, the curia regis, and that doesn't mean any certain individual. It just means let's all get together and talk, and then those who can make it, they come. So it's kind of a portable institution almost. It's like some may be there at one point, and you'll notice auxilium et concilium, help and advise. So it's almost, what do we say today, ad hoc committee? It's sort of like we are meeting and we've got a specific agenda. Usually, not always, but usually it's not going to be a fundraising committee, or you want to sell donuts. It's going to be, we're going to war, and how much can you cough up? So yes, it is going to be for support. And again, the idea of a monarch, but I've been challenged on that by a student. A student would say to me, which just seems amazing, say, are you sure about that? And I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I really do, because he said, well, if I were king, they would just do it because I said so. And then, you know, I'm thinking, good luck with that. It's just that we have these great ideals of kingship and power that even for a Charlemagne could not be done. You've got to bring people together. You've got to, in short, be a kind of politician. And say, if you do this, you'll get this, and it'll all be to mutual benefit. So the idea then is that councils provided support, encouragement, and it goes on throughout medieval period. So it's not new in that sense. What makes it new, however, is, of course, that by the 13th century, there are additions to the membership, and there are going to be requirements. And much of this we owe to the very famous Magna Carta. That's right. You always wonder, if it had not been for Magna Carta, again, this is counter history, but if there hadn't been a Magna Carta, would there have been a parliament? Maybe there would have been, but Magna Carta assures that there will be. Many of you have read Magna Carta. If you haven't, and you have time this summer, this may be something you'll want to pore over and enjoy rather than going to parties, spending time with anybody who's dissolute, or you may instead say, I want to read essays on Magna Carta. I want to be truly imbued to repent, yes, for atonement. But the idea of Magna Carta was, in part, that the king's actions would be, in a sense, overseen by the people who counted in that society. Of course, technically, they're speaking for everybody, right? But I mean, technically, but they are saying that they, the great nobles or the bishops or whoever it is, we are going to make sure that the king acts within the law. And so this body, which in a sense is the royal court of yore, but now they are acting as a sort of like, yeah, you can do this, no, you can't do that. And if you do this, you may face some serious consequences. In other words, you're affecting the royal prerogative. Well, of course, we know that King John just lived until the next year. So there wasn't much result for him, except he didn't like it, and he denounced it. As some of you will recall, though, he was succeeded by a boy, his son, who became Henry III, and he had the long and inglorious reign between 1216 and 1272, during which there was a very significant civil war. And that brings up the name of Simon de Montfort. If you don't remember the name, it's basically a leader of the nobles who doesn't care for Henry III, his own brother-in-law. And he leads this revolt of the nobles, and he will, for about a year, take over the government in the name of Henry III. I mean, he'll rule in the name of Henry III, but Henry III doesn't have anything to do with it, if you get my drift. It's sort of like, guess what? You just made a proclamation, and yet he didn't. All of this is to say that during that period, and some of you will recall, I was just talking to some of you about tours of England. There is a place in England where you could see this great tribute to Simon de Montfort. And it was actually placed there by the Parliament back in 1965. I think it was the anniversary since 1265. What would that be? 500 years? Several hundred years. And I noticed no member of the royal family attended. And I would think, yeah, I guess it kind of hurt their feelings, so they just let it go on, and they said, well, y'all have a good time at the celebration. But the Simon de Montfort really is one of the great fathers of Parliament. I indicate here that as somebody, and he didn't know he was going to lose power in 1265. He thought he could continue to run the government in the name of Henry III now. But he was going to run the government, and he was going to do so with the support of what we would call the people of the elite classes. Obviously, that includes people with titles like earls, and it, of course, includes bishops and even abbots, because some of the abbots were not the quiet, retiring type who said, I just want to study my Benedictine rule and then get some shut-eye. A lot of them were movers and shakers, given that their groups had a lot of land. And they said, we're not doing it for ourselves, we're doing this, of course, for the Lord. So, they are very important. Abbots, bishops, earls, and others. And as they did so, by Simon de Montfort's time, and it was really he, not his successor, that makes the decision, we're going to bring in knights, meaning people who have lots of land, and the people they call burgesses, or you would say bourgeois. That whole class of people, Rotarians, people who made it, okay? They're the Chamber of Commerce, okay? So those are the people you say, and rightly so. And when we say rightly so, we're thinking very 21st century, aren't we? Because why should those nobles and upper clergy have all the authority? Well, that's what these people thought too. At first, of course, I'm sure they were very awed to be called up to meet with Simon de Montfort, and I bet you these representatives of the towns and cities and so forth sat in the back. And they probably said, can we say something? We just want to say hi. We appreciate y'all asking us to come, and we just think the world of you all. You say, kissing up? I think that's what they call it. Yes, indeed. Because the idea of these leaders of towns and cities and these so-called knights, because the word is not so much knight as warrior, but knight as landowner, but without great title. These people have now come into their own. And they've come into their own first under Simon de Montfort, and then under King Edward, who will, after he gets rid of his Uncle Simon, he is massacred. And when Henry III finally dies, then Edward I will become king himself in 1272. But all of this shouldn't bother us. What is the concern is that no one now who is really politically savvy can imagine not calling representatives of these people to get their opinions. I didn't say I was going to do it. I just said I'll listen to you. And I also want you to say that you are willing to support my programs for revenue enhancement. I believe that's what they call raising taxes. Because that's very, very important. And again, I cannot emphasize it too much. They're not institutionalized at this point. It's not an institution. The king or the king's representative would say, we are just going to have a parliament. And that means we are going to have, and from parlay, we're going to have a speak. And we'll do the talking and you'll do the listening until I tell you to speak. And then mostly you will say, oh, great one, we love you. You're so wonderful. And again, if you read some of the old things, you would think they were completely just sycophants. But that will change. That certainly will change. Edward II, well, we know that was not a happy time for the development of medieval kingship. He was busy, he had lots of social activities. Enough said about that. But interestingly, when he was crowned king, they added to the coronation the phrase that he would essentially support the law. It was, in effect, something that will come to haunt him later on. And it will come to haunt him when, as some of you will recall, his queen and her main squeeze had him in a less than pleasant circumstance. All of this is to say that the monarchy did not do well in this period. Is this a move for Parliament? Well, it's certainly a move for the nobility and those who want, what shall I say, a sharing of the authority, because Edward II and his entourage ran the government during that period for themselves. And we assume, and I'm going very quickly here, but I'm assuming that at this point you'll remember that after poor Edward was done in, and he's just a little fellow, little Edward III, and his mother and Uncle Roger are running the government. And, you know, he's got a lot of time in between extracurricular activities. You know, his sports. I'm sure he was involved. And he's thinking, you know, my father was kind of a loser. My grandfather was really outstanding. And I'm really getting sick of having to pretend to like Uncle Roger. And I wish he would go home before we have breakfast. You know, that kind of thing. So, all in all, this basically introduces the change to come. And that, of course, is going to be Edward III. However, before we leave, I thought you would enjoy an illustration that was made of what they thought a parliament was going to be like. What you have there, and again, they call it the model parliament. It met in 1295, and you'll notice Edward, the king, is up there, and you say, well, who are the little folks? Well, That includes the King of Scotland, that's over there. He said, well, why couldn't they get a chair high enough to... Well, let's just say that that was done on purpose. And I think it was probably done by somebody from England. What do you think? So, you can be a king, but you're not as big a king as I am, okay? Some are equal, but I'm the most equal of all. Now, on the other side, the other fellow, it doesn't even get to be a king. He's called the Prince of Wales. Llewellyn was his name, but he gets a seat up there. And so he said, Alex, Lou, I'm about to proclaim this. And they go, great, boss. Again, imaginary, because it didn't happen that way, but that is the way that it's supposed to work. And you see the scholars back there, and you see the folks in black who are probably going to be representatives of the towns and the people who have great land. And of course, in the front, you have the great clergy, bishops. Of course, you have the archbishops of York and Canterbury up in the front. I would be one of those little fellows with the black hat, taking notes, you know. Little stenography there, yeah. But important without really being important, you know what I mean. So it's, you see the archbishops, and everybody has a place to be. And again, that is the concept that they would have had at that particular time. It's one body, and it would be in other cases. The idea of having a bicameral legislature is not necessarily that which everyone followed. In this case, however, that is not the original. The original is the unicameral. And here is what we know about it from a little work in Latin, translated here, and probably written about 1300. Now, you'll notice that it starts out talking about AIDS, and some of you will recall the feudal idea of the feudal lord having the right to expect 3 aids from his vassal. That's the eldest daughter's marriage, or the eldest son's knighting, or for his ransom. Now, by 1300, they're saying just generally knighting and marrying. And boy, if you have a whole slew of them, you better be ready to pay out, because that can get expensive. Again, it's supposed to be a certain amount, I guess, regardless of inflation. I don't think they could say, well, last year's prices for a band are not going to be the same prices. Or if you want an open bar, because that's expensive, unless you're serving just nice beverages, iced tea maybe. That could be inexpensive, but not the kind of things they have at those, oh my gosh, band or adult beverages, woo. What goes on to be interesting, and be it known that if such aids are to be granted, all the peers of Parliament ought to consent. We'll go into peers momentarily. And be it known, and I think this is so interesting, that the 2 knights who come to Parliament for the shire, meaning the local area, have a greater voice in Parliament. For formerly, kings held their parliaments when no bishop, earl, or baron was present. In other words, folks, Barons and earls represent only themselves, but the knights represent the people. In other words, the idea is that that upper crust simply speak for themselves as the king's advisors. But now we are seeing these lower people as having a great role because they are authorized, as our members of Congress are, to speak for us. The idea is a very, very important one if you stop to think about it. And they're already theorizing about it, as you can see, in probably about 1300, meaning late Edward I or early Edward II. I think the translator probably is a little hesitant about trying to get more specific, but that's okay. We understand what he's getting at, and it's still, in a sense, unicameral. We don't even have it split up into two different houses, and that's kind of interesting when you stop and think about it. Now, we know that these big shots, these title people, are still running it, because I dare say that during the unfortunate period of Edward II, I don't think any of the townspeople or the knights would have said, well, let's have a coup d'etat against the king's government. I had a nice note from Queen Isabella yesterday. You know, I think they are ready to follow, you know. That's the, yeah, you know, it's hard to believe, isn't it? They just don't have that kind of power yet. That is coming, though. It's certainly true that in the years to come, certainly by the end of the 14th century, that we know that Parliament is firmly entrenched. So entrenched that all of the troubles, and I mean all, will not displace Parliament. Nobody can come along and say, no, we don't want a Parliament anymore. Some of you will remember the Estates General, which was just whisked away in 1790. Another date to remember. French Revolution, yeah. I mean, and you say, wow, but wasn't it venerable? Well, shoot, yeah, the first time it met, it was 1302. And then you go out, hit the streets of Paris and ask them, hey, what do y'all know about the Estates General? Those people will be ugly. They might use a bad word to make you leave them alone, because they don't care about any Estates General. It's what you call history. But in the case of Parliament, none of the troubles of the 15th century, and of course I'm talking about the Wars of the Roses, nor the Reformation to come in the 16th century, will displace Parliament. And some of you probably studied the reign of Queen Elizabeth, will know that some of those fellas in Parliament would get a little free about what they wanted to say. And they'd say, well, shoot, I'm a Puritan and I can just say whatever I please because I've got the right in Parliament. Well, the Queen doesn't think so. How would you like to spend a week in the Tower as a royal guest? Yeah. And don't tell me about your rights, because I'll decide what your rights are, you loser. And so, yeah, she locked him up. But the point is, she never tried to abolish Parliament, nor did Henry VIII, her father. It was accepted. But In the next period, the Stuarts, which is another interesting period, a king would lose his head over it, over the rights of Parliament in 1649, King Charles I. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that even though at times parliamentary authority seems pretty shaky, we at least will appreciate the fact that throughout this period, it is gaining strength. Not that kings intended to strengthen it to be in any way a threat to them. The kings merely thought of Parliament as a way to enhance their own authority. That's the truth. If some king had said, I just want to reach out and just love on all my subjects, and this is, I just can't see that. I can just see this as a way of saying, I want their approval. And this may, of course, come from the fact that they need more money. Isn't that always? Yeah. Why do they need more money? Well, we all know that if, and I'm not sure about this, but if Edward III had come in with a large treasury, and I'm not saying he was exactly poor, but I'm thinking his mother and Uncle Roger probably spent up a lot between themselves and their friends, and that is, and their predecessors, Edward II, his boy Hugh Despenser, they spent up plenty too. So government waste was very characteristic of the preceding period. But whatever the case, we all know from our own experiences in life that war is expensive. We just finished hearing about that. Nobody can say, let's just have a cheap little war and make it as economical as possible. This is a budget war. No. And this, of course, will be very important because Edward III, as you'll recall, will be at war with both France and Scotland during large parts, I'll say, of his reign. As a result of that fact, and this isn't the only one, but it is a very important one, as a result of the wars, I think we always have to remember that Parliament will gain the upper hand. I don't think it fair to say that that was the only factor. But if Edward III had not, and we talked about the 100 Years' War, if you'll recall, I think if Edward III had basically been, which almost sounds like a contradiction in terms in the Middle Ages, a pacifist medieval ruler, it could be a lot more economical. But of course, what's the point of being king? Edward III wanted the whole business. And he was willing to spend as much money as it took. Not his, but everybody else's. And so in order to obtain it and in order to gain what I would call popular support, again, popular not so much from ordinary people, but from the people who ran things back home. Those kinds of people, parliaments will become more useful. Sir? Yes? Please.
How about a bloodline? I mean, I see all these names, and I know that they're connected, father, son, daughter, and so on.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard you mention, not once, in the lectures I've heard, the bloodline.
How do we know?
Well, how about the text, or the books?
Oh yeah, the genealogical charts.
Yes.
It's supposed to be, yes. I mean, occasionally somebody might have slipped in. I mean, yeah, you know, it's, weren't you talking, Frank, I think it was last week, about one of the pretenders
Yes.
to the throne of, that became Henry VII? Mm-hmm. Who was just, but
He was nobody, really.
he was, but he looked like somebody. And you know, it's like Royal Most Wanted or something like that. You have always that problem in terms of what you say, bloodlines, about people who may not be the real McCoy. There's a wonderful book, in case you're interested in this, it's called The Return of Martin Guerre. Have you read that, Jenny? It's about 17th century France, and this fellow comes back home from war, and they think it's him, but then it could be someone else, and his wife just accepts him, and then... the idea is, though, that there probably were somewhere along the line, I think in terms of Catherine the Great's son and successor, there are stories that she didn't really like her husband. And she had some dates, and I think that's what they call it nowadays. And I think it's possible that one of the dates was the father of the Tsar Paul. Oh, yeah, I know that, but I meant in addition, she had a very, very active life. And during those activities, the new Romanov may have come along. I just think it's interesting, yeah, how in particular these dynasties, as far as Edward III is concerned, his parents were at that point in their marriage pretty happy, and it was a limited time, but it was time enough for, I guess, him and his brother to come along. But yeah, I guess in many cases we'll never really know the whole truth. Now, one aspect of Parliament that has certainly not been true for centuries, but was true way back when, is the idea of the king calling the Parliament. And then when he says, you know, this has been real. It's time to say goodbye. I've loved every minute. But get your things together, and you need to pack. I bet the family is missing you. Yeah, so he just sends them out, and when the day comes, of course, that they are so embodied that they call themselves into sessions, that's going to be a big change. But back in this period, they come and they go. I don't know whether they meet as long as the king is pleased with them or he doesn't need them. I mean, they've given their opinion. They have voted in support of his whatever revenue ideas, or he says, I've got this strategy for France or Scotland, whatever it may be. But they are not there to be a permanent body. He doesn't want them, doesn't need them, he thinks. He just wants them to go. You'll notice his reign was a long, long one. Basically 1327 to 1377. And so 48 sessions of Parliament during those years. And that's why this is so important, because during all of these decades, the gradual trends, I guess you would call this the glory of administrative history. You could read volume after volume. Believe me, you would never need a sleeping aid. No Sominex needed here. You get a few volumes of administrative history and say, oh, boy, yes, kick back in that lazy boy and you'll be gone. Administrative history is for the really, really hard and tough. Yeah, it's, but it's fascinating to see how these institutions evolve and the time period over which it happens. Now, again, you don't have to have knights and burgesses. I always think that's kind of interesting. It's not like, oh, we don't want to miss them. They're so interesting. They just, oh, the conversation, they're just fabulous. No, but they are important. And they will become increasingly important over time. I think that's what's so interesting to me. When they start out, you know, in Simon de Montfort's day, and they're kind of hanging in the back and saying, well, golly, look at all these bishops, and y'all are so mighty. I mean, you know, we play up to those fancy folks. But as the reign of Edward III goes on, we feel like these people are far more self-assured and confident, and they understand that they are going to have a highly important role to play. And of course, this will lead to this evolution of House of Lords and House of Commons. I don't know if in the 21st century the House of Lords is going to make it. I just don't know. I keep wondering if they will someday go unicameral, that is, the United Kingdom, because, well, I mean, it just doesn't have the same meaning. Life has changed a lot in the United States as well as Britain. But let's talk about how life was in the 14th century. The House of Lords is a body that is very medieval. And if you ever saw them, I think it was C-SPAN, a lot of them fall asleep during their meetings, and you say, oh, you miss part of the meeting? Oh, I think that it's like Volume 3 of Administrative History. I mean, it's like they just don't do a lot that is today considered highly important. Now, that's quite the reverse, isn't it, from the 14th century? Because remember, sitting in the House of Lords will be all these people who are what today we would call movers and shakers. These are the great nobles, the great churchmen. They are in many ways, what I refer to as the natural advisors of the king. He may not like them, but he needs them because they're so important. So, if we ever want to have a sign about evolving democracy in the 20th and 21st centuries, the decline of lords and the ascension of commons tells us all we need to know, right? Lower clergy, that's an odd business to think about, but they came for a while, but they begin to stop coming because they know why they're being called. And remember, not everybody comes. Understand there will be elections of sorts in the towns and shires. And are these elections rigged? Well, let's just say they are. They have some planning involved in them by the sheriff and other royal representatives. So it's pretty clear that people who are chosen are people of great dignity. But these lower clergy, the pastor of St. Such and Such, you know, he knows why he's there. He's there to vote for some sort of financial allocation that the king has proposed. And you know where or how this is going to come out. It's going to come out of the church's revenues. You say, well, gosh, I thought we were going to build a new youth sanctuary or something like that. Well, I guess next year, because the king's got to go kill more Frenchmen. All of this then is to say that the clergy decide they can do all their business at what will be called convocation, a word some of you may have heard from your own faiths. Convocation having to do with calling together, a body called together. And there the clergy, they'll get a nice note. Dear clergy, we love you and we appreciate all you do. And the Lord says hi. Your Lord in heaven and the Lord right here. And so that means fork it up, baby. And that now they will do on their own. And this will go on particularly after Henry breaks with the Pope, you know, the Tudors, because these convocations, they can say, well, we still kind of love the Pope. Maybe we can give him part of the no. He's getting nothing. It's all going to the king. So they're out of the picture, and we now understand that there will be other changes. And one, and which I think most people will find interesting, is the development of the class of nobles who are called peers. And you've heard about the peerage. And I still wonder how much of this will exist in another few decades. But it was very, very important in this particular period. And there we'll start after a very, very short break. It's our last day. But let's, how long do they have, Frank?
3 minutes and 22 seconds.
3 minutes and 22 seconds. So I would hightail it if I were you. You remember the reign of Edward III.
I remember 1453. It was the end of
Judith,
the Roman Empire.
the knowledge, your knowledge. You just pull it out like a drawer from a bureau. It's despite the social aspects of your collegiate education. You still remember what you've learned. And I respect that you can do both. It's called burning the candle at both ends.
That's the most fun.
I know. Her weekends just, oh, even on school nights. Even on school night, sure.
Imagine what the weekends are.
No, I don't even, I don't think. That's when I do crosswords and
Sunday night.
have an extra Diet Coke, yeah. So,
I want to know how the Windsors won out. You got the Stuarts and the Tudors and all this, but the last 3 times, 3 kings or queens have been Windsors, so how did they win out? We quit fighting over it?
oh, they chose that name.
Okay, so that's
Is that
just
one?
I know,
You know, they're Germans.
right?
And during World War I,
Got it better than
I do
Pope's,
know that
whatever the
Elizabeth-
heck it was. Blank.
Victoria, yeah.
Well, that's what I was looking up. I know that Elizabeth chose it because, but she just,
But they had done that long before her
that's
day.
what I was fixing to say. The last 3,
Yeah, yeah.
Elizabeth, her
It was
father,
all
and
about
grandfather
World War
was the first
I.
of the Windsors.
Right, it was all like Battenberg.
Yeah, because it sounded too German.
Sounded too
Right.
We just couldn't have anything that was German.
Right.
But,
What happened? Why did the Stuarts and the Tudors and all those?
well, they died out, and then the first one was George I. You remember? After Queen Anne was the last Stuart. You heard of Queen Anne? Okay. I think they made a movie about her recently.
Back to work, right?
Oh, okay. All right. I know, and I appreciate it. The War of the Spanish Succession, Queen Anne, Duke of Marlborough, Blenheim Palace. Does any of that ring a bell? No. Well, you know, it just part part of the thing. That's when the first German became king, George the First, the grandfather of George the Third. The nobles will, of course, come in a variety of ranks, and then when the monarchs decide, well, we want to ennoble people, and you can imagine why, there may have something to do with a financial issue. Or it could be we just want to honor someone or say to them they're good people, whatever it is. But they will add titles, maybe not, but there will be titles such as Duke and Baronet and all kinds of titles. And I can just imagine that first generation of people who had those titles. You know, it's kind of embarrassing when you go to parties and people say, oh, you're new noble, huh? But a few generations and they'll get over it. In any event, among nobles there are levels, which is hard to believe, but as it comes out that the way that they actually determined who made it into the House of Lords would be based on what they call the peers. And this peerage would mean that they and bishops and abbots would be summoned to every parliament regularly. This became part and parcel. And if you weren't on that special list, well, you're still noble, you're not denobilized, but you would just not appear the realm. And I always thought that was very interesting because of the fact that in modern times, very recent times, the idea of the lifetime peerage began. So that would cut out that whole issue of your blood strain, because you could be of any blood and you get that lifetime peerage, that's yours, because whatever the leader of the government meant when he or she gave you that lifetime peerage, because it has nothing to do, presumably, with the former characteristics. It has to do now with whatever the government wants to do, and I guess now Theresa May. For how long, I don't know, but that's the way it is now. But this, of course, the hereditary peerage, and again, now we're talking bloodlines here, and there are questions about bloodlines always, but technically, if you are the eldest son, that will be your position. You gain that because it belongs to the family. And this House of Lords would include bishops and abbots. Now, clearly, that doesn't mean that all of them come to every meeting. They come when they come. And, of course, after Henry VIII, abbots won't be coming anymore. Because there won't be any abbots, right? So that ends that. It's very interesting to stop and think about what a difference that would make. I'm not sure how great a role they played, because essentially they were there because they were high-ranking. Abbots are great nobles, and we like them because technically they can't have children, and therefore we don't have to worry about hereditary issues, and because they are in charge of vast estates, lands, and that means revenue. And the king is going to call on them to share those revenues. I mean, you are part of our... I mean, there are a lot of demands on these people, financially speaking. I think sometimes we don't realize that. Their powers were very great, and they did, by, I guess, the second half of the 14th century, hear judicial cases. For example, if a nobleman was accused of some wrongdoing, well, obviously he's not going to go to an ordinary court. And so they would take it upon themselves to judge him or her. In other words, you have to be someone of high rank, and that means that Parliament, in this case the House of Lords, would judge you. And believe me, I think that is one of those last powers that they have kept. And I don't know if anybody has used it in the last few years, few decades, but it was very present during most of the centuries that follow. That is the powerhouse of Lords in terms of major judicial cases, which I think is very interesting. Now, again, commons, and the development of commons will have to do with the coming together of burgesses and knights. That's always an interesting story to me, how burgesses and knights, you got the land and I got the money. I think there's something there. I think it could be loved. Clearly, parents arrange this, and it will take time, because you can imagine if you were a knight's son and your parents come to you and say, oh, guess what? There's this beautiful burgess's daughter, and I think y'all would be a great catch. And she, oh, Mommy, do I have to? Because, you know, they would consider these people beneath them. Everybody's got to have somebody to rule over, right? So the knights don't come to the burgesses think it's wonderful, of course, because they figure that in a generation or two, nobody will know. But we know from our own 19th, 20th century how American rich women married into the English nobility. Think of the Duke of Marlborough, for example. Just to give you an example, the Vanderbilt. I mean, this has been going on a long, long time, and it was going on then. And it seems to me that a lot of it started with these intermarriages. As long as they are two groups, they may, I mean, they both have to kind of get in the back, you know, when Simon de Montfort called them and said, can we ever, hey, Simon, we're here, you know, and it's like, they don't get a lot of attention. But I think the idea of their coming together through marriage and social position is going to strengthen them a great deal, particularly because during these centuries, gosh, when you stop and think about the agricultural changes that are going to make farming so much more profitable. Because remember, these folks, it's not like 40 acres and a mule. We are talking about folks with a lot of land and a lot of profit, and people who have high positions in these growing towns and cities. I'm saying that combined, they really create a very, very important block, power block. And that's your House of Commons. And you say, well, who's representing the regular folks? Well, they are, theoretically. Not really, but theoretically. In other words, there's nobody there that would be classified as a peasant, or anybody who could say, well, I'm just, you know, I'm just a clerk at a store somewhere, and I just thought I'd sit here in the House of Commons. No, you won't. You need to be working. So these people in the House of Commons are not, it's not reach out and touch working people, okay? So I think it's very important that we always bear that in mind. That is going to be a long time coming. But the House of Commons, representing these great sources of wealth, land, towns, and cities, are a very, very important ally, or in some cases, enemy of the crown. You want them to be on your side. Now, interestingly, as it will come about, is the concept of redress before supply. And I love that, because I guess sometimes we do that in child rearing. Basically, you have certain grievances, and so instead of just forking over money to the youth, you state, now here is what's expected from you. And say, oh, well, maybe. No, it will be done or you won't get anything. Yeah, that's what redress before supply means. Parliamentary leaders, and you wonder, would they have said that directly to the monarch? I don't think so. I think you would have said it maybe in very nice language, to the royal ministers who represented the king. And what it means is, when Parliament is assembled, they will present to the monarchy their suggestions. I want to say that word, not say demands. Ooh, I think that's a little sassy, as we used to say. I don't think you're supposed to be saying, you want money? Here's what you better do. No, you say, may it please, O dread sovereign. Let me, you have all that language, you lay it on thick. And then you say, and we see this clearly, and it goes all the way into Stuart times when they speak, and maybe they still do with Queen Elizabeth. But we know the reality of power. But the point is, redressing of grievances. These representatives from the House of Commons want their issues talked about and in some way dealt with. And then we'll be thrilled to vote on that financial proportion. So you say, well, does that make everybody happy? Well, no. I'm sure there were lots of unhappy people. But that's part, I guess, of the whole give and take of the political system. That's what I figure in any event. And particularly in a time period which was so topsy-turvy in terms of wars and a variety of other controversies. They did insist that for any kind of edict to become an official law, or statute as they would say, it had to be approved by both houses of Commons. And again, that would have been unheard of in centuries past. This really, really adds to the authority of Parliament when they persuade royal officials that they must put their imprimatur on a royal edict for it to become true law. That's almost revolutionary, I would say. And they carry it out. Two of the statutes are of particular interest to me. They are both in the 14th century. They are both very characteristic of this day and age of the time of Edward III, the time of wars And lest anyone forget, and you mentioned Donna Bohannon's lecture, we know about the Black Death and all of these other issues. And these I want you to be very aware of. The statute of provisors. Do you know, this is a funny little typing joke, they kept trying to make me correct the word provisors. You know, when you type it on the computer and they think, well, you don't know, you think that's a word? And I said, and you know, I talked ugly to my computer, that, you know, because I said, yes, you dolt, it is a word. What it means is who provides a particular church living. That's fairly esoteric, isn't it? You don't hear that a lot. But it was, in fact, a right that the local Lord customarily had. He has the right to give that living. It's called a living for the vicar of that area or other clergy. Unfortunately for the local lords, lots of other people had been stepping in, like bishops or even kings, or maybe sometimes the man in Rome. We have all kinds of provisions, and it's a way to say, I really understand that your nephew needs to get a job. Let me see if I can work something out for some sort of living like that. And you say, well, that isn't right. And I'm glad you feel that way. And I want you to remember that as we think of governments and how they fill spots with people. But that is the way it was done, because I've studied papal provisions. It's absolutely fascinating. You say, what's a nice Italian boy doing in a place like this? But that's how it happens. And oh, and sometimes you could be an absentee pluralist, and you say, oh, I know, Nurse Janet comes to the rescue. These people, absentee pluralists, mean you might have a variety of provisions, but you're not there. You appoint somebody, and then you take half a cut. You say, but that's not right. Thank you, yes. But it happens. The statute of provisors essentially tries to cut out and say that the local lords has the right to provide people to those positions. The statute of laborers limits the pay of laborers to what was offered for their positions before the Black Death. Because as you know, the Black Death created a great desire for workers, and now they're trying to cut back. So you say, but this isn't right. No, but this is the way government can work sometimes. They are answering to what those elements in Parliament wanted, and the king wanted their support. And that's the way he expressed it, by giving them statutes of this sort. But it's to say that they are both a product of Crown and Parliament working together. And in the statute of provisors, which I'm not sure how successful it was, but it's trying to limit the number of powerful institutions that can put people into church jobs so that they can keep their power bases. Edward's reign, again, ranks so high, well, not only because it was so long, but because it was so corrupt. He goes on and on and on. And when he dies, this is really bad. When he's dying, his companion will be there along with his family, and she gets all his rings and nice things. And she doesn't even stay to cry. She's just out of there with all that jewelry. That's the story you always read about that. So she said, this is my retirement account. She was getting everything together as she was on the way out, and that was 1377. But his government was so corrupt, and you know how they always say, how corrupt was it? It was so corrupt with so many people, nepotism and other kinds of bad malfeasance was going on. You're thinking, oh no, what do we do? Yes, impeachment. Yes. And boy, oh boy, did this process begin to bring lots of people in royal government down. And it's very interesting when you think about it, because until the time of the Stuarts in the 17th century, we can't reach the top level, but we can reach some of the people around the king, and that who are the most obvious, you know, who are the most corrupt. And so this process will actually begin. And it begins because the level of corruption is so great that these particular targets are easy for people who want to get them. I'm not sure whether they really want to have clean government so much as they resent that they don't get more of the profits themselves. Whatever the case, we know how it works. The case for impeachment will be presented in the House of Commons and then will be tried in the House of Lords. In some cases, and this will go on into the reign of Richard II, we will know of individuals who will decide, you know, France is so lovely this time of year. And so, what time do you have the next ship leaving for Calais? I'm on it, man. Get up everything. So, yeah, it's very, very interesting when you think about that. The good Parliament of 1376. Now, I know I've tried to minimize the number of dates that you're required to learn. Yeah. Because I want to be as kind a taskmaster as possible. But 1376, the death of the Black Prince, yeah. And the year before, the death of Edward III and the accession of Richard II. So now that can be remembered for your final. So, seriously, the good Parliament will bring about the first cases of the impeachment, which some people, as you know, those of you who've been teachers who hear people thinking impeachment means the actual conviction, instead of thinking that this is merely the indictment. But that happened in many cases in the later years of Edward III, and even more so with our final person. Boy, oh boy, Richard II. Very bad times. You remember 1377 to 1399. And he had lots of ministers because this guy would not play with Parliament. Richard II did not want them telling him what to do. And his ministers who carried out his government were sitting pretty for the charges against them. And again, I use that word them advisedly because we know that it was all about Parliament against Richard II. And you say, will this story have a happy ending? I think not. I believe he became Sir Richard of Bordeaux during his last days, yes. I'm sad to say his demise was in confinement in 1399. And with that, of course, will come the beginnings of the Lancastrians and the Wars of the Roses. This, in a sense, that is Henry, son of John of Gaunt, becoming king may well be connected to Parliament. Well, what does that say about Parliament? That Parliament's going through a period of getting along and sort of whoever seems to be in charge will give them the big rah-rah. But it's there, and its life as a major institution is assured. And after the execution, and remember, this is another date you should remember, 1649, the death of Charles I. You'll be glad you know this. The victory of Parliament is pretty well assured, because remember, it will be in the years to come, as somebody said, with these Germans who come to rule, so-called Windsors. The victory of Parliament over the monarchy is definitely assured, and as it is today. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate it. And I hope to see you in the fall.